Most people choose to pursue an MBA degree with a goal in mind, maybe a career change, a new outlook on life. But what really happens? INSEAD professor Jennifer Petriglieri has just completed a case study called 10 Years Later, and she joins us now to tell us what it's all about. Welcome to INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, the case study, Memoirs of Life and Work a Decade After an MBA. That sounds quite portentous. What is this case study about? You actually looked at people 10 years after the MBA.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because the case study actually forms part of a much larger effort to try and understand the lives, the career choices and the personal dilemmas of so-called high potential managers. And so the case really tries to understand, what happens next and tries to move beyond the cliche of thinking of people coming to an MBA to get a very high salary or a very high status job, which really doesn't do justice to the breadth and the depth of experiences these students bring into the classroom.
How did you happen to choose the year 2000, that class, and then how did you get them all to participate, or did they all participate?
So we were looking for a decade, so we chose 2002, simply kind of working backwards, looking at people who graduated a year ago.
It's a new millennium.
We emailed the class of 2002 and we were completely overwhelmed with stories, to the point when we had to, say to people, thanks but no thanks. They were so generous with their stories. And the amazing thing about the stories is the diversity. So they come from people who originate and live on every continent on earth. They're from big corporations, from not-for-profit, family business, entrepreneurial ventures.
Was there much difference between men and women? I would imagine maybe not. Maybe by 2000 there weren't that many differences.
Yeah, surprisingly not. In fact, we were talking with some of my students and they said really if you took some of the names away and some of the personal details, it would be very difficult to tell whether these stories were from men or women. And I think if we look across the patterns across the narratives, everyone, men and women alike, were really facing two kind of main dilemmas. One was to try and craft a career trajectory that was both successful and meaningful to them. And of course, these two things don't necessarily always align. And so what we tended to find was the graduates, as they were graduating, felt under quite a bit of pressure, both social and quite frankly financial, to get quite a high status, well-paying job. But what typically happened was after 2 to 3 years, most graduates made a shift. Not necessarily outside of their company, but either to something else or to a different role that was more aligned to who they were as individuals. So, for example, someone moved into the renewable energies industry. So people tended to make this shift after 2 to 3 years, and they were really trying to have this alignment between who they were and their work. The second pattern, perhaps not surprisingly, was the strive for work-life balance. And this, again, was felt by men and women alike. Now, although very few of the graduates felt they'd attained their dream balance, all of them really saw their task of the next decade to really work towards that. And when you think about work-life balance, it wasn't just between, for example, kids and work. It was also about different domains of their life. So perhaps some of them had aging parents, about hobbies and dreams they'd always wanted to pursue themselves, and of course their immediate families and relationships with spouses and partners. So it was really a range of things.
Where did the idea for this case study come from? Has there been something like this in the past?
Yeah, so the idea really came from two avenues. I mean, one is my research in general on this population and teaching, and what the feedback I often get from talking to MBAs and graduates is that there's very little chance for them to address these questions of career and life choices outside of the very cliche conversations around finding your ideal or perfect job. The second thing is there is quite an old case study from the Harvard Business School alumni class of 1976, which is along a similar vein. And I've used this in the past with my students, and they've always fed back that it's a great case, but they would love to hear this from an INSEAD perspective, people who are closer to them in age, and also have much more international careers and mobile lives, which is really the norm of the business context today.
What did you hope to learn from this study, and what surprised you?
I think one of the things we hoped to learn was really the diversity of things that people did. And it's coming back to this idea, this classic idea that, MBAs almost selfishly pursue rapid career growth. And I think these narratives and this case study really shatters these stereotypes of MBAs single-mindedly going after things for themselves and not considering others. if we come back to this pattern of meaningful activities.
Now, you're using this in your classes now. In which class are you using it?
So I use this case of part of an elective called Psychological Issues in Management. So in a nutshell, the course really gives students the opportunity to explore and ask questions that are most meaningful to them. So sometimes these are really big questions like, who am I? What do I want to do with my life? Where am I going? And for some students, they're much more specific ones. You know, should I join the family business? Why do I behave in this way? And is it possible for me to change some of my behaviours? And this case in particular, I use to allow students to really explore the future. I ask them to write their own prospective 10-year narrative and then share these with their classmates and think, if I continued making the kind of life choices and patterns I'm doing now, what might happen? What might pan out in my life? And what's interesting is really opening the lid on this and them seeing that sometimes the forces that pull us forward are not necessarily pulling us in a direction that we want to go in. And so I think by opening up these narratives, they can really start analysing, is this the path I want to be on? And is this a direction I want to go on? And if not, what might I need to change to get there?
So how are they reacting to these case studies? This must be almost, maybe they're seeing reflections of themselves?
Absolutely. So many of the students can identify with obviously the protagonists of the case study. You know, these are people who quite literally sat in their chairs 10 years ago. And so I think for some of them there's an aha moment. I think quite frankly for some of them there's also almost a warning sign.
So let me end by asking you, if you received a request to fill out a survey like this or write your own narrative, what would you say?
It's actually a very timely question because next year will be 10 years since I graduated from my MBA program.
Aha.
So I think, wow. So I think I would tell a story of obviously moving from the corporate world into academia, of marriage and 3 international moves, 2 trilingual children, and I guess all the excitement that goes with that. And I think I've been extremely fortunate to find a career that is personally meaningful to me and that I genuinely love. And that doesn't mean it's easy all the time, and it doesn't mean I don't have doubts. There are ups and downs, and I think that's part of the journey.
Great. Well, Jennifer Petriglieri, thank you very much for being with us on INSEAD Knowledge.